It started with a wooden button, brown, ordinary, worn smooth by a small boy's grip. It had come off a dead woman's Sunday dress, and it held more weight than anything a scale could measure. By the time this story was over, that button would change hands twice, and the second time would be the one that broke you. The heat had a weight to it heavy. Windless scorch had cracked the earth around Elk Ridge into patterns that resembled broken china. July in Colorado wasn't supposed to feel like this, the air above the road rippling, bending, lying to you about what was ahead. Even the horses tied outside the general store stood with their heads low, breathing through the heat like it was something they had to chew before they could swallow. Now, you have to understand something about the woman who stepped off the stagecoach that Tuesday afternoon. Ruth Calhoun was 23 years old, and she carried everything she owned in a suitcase held together by rope because the latches had given out somewhere between Kansas and the territorial line. There was flour dust on her left sleeve that she hadn't bothered brushing off, and calluses on both palms thick enough that she'd stopped noticing them years ago. In her pocket was a letter of reference signed by a man who'd been dead 3 months. She walked the main street of Elk Ridge with the kind of posture that comes from deciding, very early, that nobody gets to see you break. The general store had a sign in the window, "Help Needed." Ruth straightened her collar and walked in. The man behind the counter looked her up and down once. "We ain't hiring women." The hotel was next. The clerk didn't look up from his ledger. "Full up," he said, which they both knew was a lie because Ruth could see 4 empty key hooks behind his head. She didn't argue. She'd learned by 20 that arguing with men who've already decided costs more energy than it returns. She sat on the bench outside the post office. The wood was hot enough to feel through her skirt. She took the reference letter from her pocket, unfolded it, read the dead man's handwriting one more time, industrious, reliable, of good character, and folded it back carefully along the same creases. She put it away. She looked at the street. The street looked back with the blank indifference of a place that hadn't asked her to come. Nowhere to go. She knew this the way you know weather, not as information but as something sitting on your skin. 2 women crossed to the opposite side of the road when they passed the bench. A dog limped through a strip of shade and didn't stop. The sun pressed down on Ruth's shoulders and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, still as a fence post, because she had nowhere to be and no one expecting her anywhere on this earth. A man walked past. 2 boys pulled at his coat, one on each side, tugging him in directions he clearly hadn't chosen. He was tall, angular, moving with the stiff economy of someone who hadn't slept properly in a long time. He walked past the bench. Then he stopped. He turned back. He didn't seem to know why. He looked at her hands first, the calluses, then the flour dust on her sleeve. His eyes stayed there a beat too long, like he was remembering something. "You looking for work?" His voice was flat, not unkind, just scraped clean of anything extra. Ruth looked at the 2 boys. The older one, 7, maybe 8, watched her with eyes that belonged on a man 3 times his age. The younger one, barely 4, clutched something small in his fist and pressed his face into his father's leg. "Depends on the work," she said. 2 boys and a man who stopped Ezra Hollis hadn't planned on stopping. He'd come to town for salt and nails, same as every Tuesday, and he'd planned on getting home before the heat got worse, which it always did after 2 o'clock. But something about the way she sat on that bench, not waiting for anyone, not expecting anything, caught in his chest like a fishbone he couldn't cough loose. His ranch was 4 miles east of town. It hadn't had a decent meal cooked in it since Nora died. And that was 8 months ago now. He hadn't told anyone how bad it had gotten. The dishes stacked in the basin growing a smell he pretended not to notice. The cold beans from cans that Levi opened with a knife because Ezra kept forgetting to buy a proper opener. The way Jonah had stopped asking for bread because there was never any bread. "I got a ranch needs keepin'," he said. "Cookin', cleanin', mindin' the boys when I'm workin' cattle, room and board, $1 a week." The woman on the bench studied him the way you'd study a contract looking for the small print that would cost you later. "I don't need more than that," she said. "Good, 'cause there ain't more than that." They walked. Levi kept 6 feet behind, his boots scuffing the dust with a deliberateness that said everything about what he thought of this arrangement. Jonah. Though Jonah reached up after the first quarter mile and took Ruth's hand, she let him. Didn't make a fuss about it. Didn't squeeze. Didn't look down with that pitying softness that strangers sometimes aimed at motherless children. She just let his hand be in hers like it had always been there. The ranch came into view and Ezra watched her eyes move across it. He tried to see it through a stranger's gaze and couldn't manage anything but shame. The fence along the south pasture broken in 3 places, wire sagging between leaning posts. Shirts on the line he'd forgotten 4 days ago, stiff now and sun-bleached. The porch steps where Nora's rocking chair still sat facing the road, as if she might come walking up it any minute. Inside was worse. Dishes crusted in the basin. Flour spilled on the counter from Levi's failed attempt at biscuits last week. The table set for 3 but only 1 chair pulled out. Levi and Jonah ate on the floor most nights because the table felt too large with just the 3 of them. Too many empty sides. Ruth set her suitcase by the door. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at the apron hanging on the hook by the stove Nora's. Still there. Because Ezra couldn't bring himself to move it and couldn't have explained why if someone had held a gun to his temple. She didn't touch it. She rolled up her sleeves and started with the dishes. Ezra leaned against the doorframe watching a stranger scrub 8 months of neglect off his plates. And he didn't have a single word for what he felt. So he did what he always did. He said nothing. He turned around. He went back to work. The kitchen smelled like something he'd forgotten. 3 days changed the bones of the house. Ruth baked bread on the first morning. The smell reached Ezra in the barn and he stood there with a bridle in his hands, not moving, because the kitchen hadn't smelled like rising dough since before Jonah was born. By the second day she'd scrubbed the floors, aired the bedding, and hung curtains she'd fashioned from a flour sack because the afternoon sun turned the front room into a furnace. By the third, she'd reorganized the pantry, patched a hole in the screen door, and taught Jonah the names of 4 different birds just by pointing out the kitchen window. Jonah followed her everywhere. He sat on the kitchen floor while she cooked, holding the wooden button he never let go of a small brown thing, ordinary, from a Sunday dress that used to hang in the bedroom closet. Ezra had never explained it to anyone. Jonah had pulled it off the dress 3 days after Nora's funeral and hadn't released it since. Levi ate on the porch, every meal, without fail. He took his plate outside and sat on the top step with his back to the kitchen door. Ruth didn't push. She left his portion on the counter each time. Covered with a cloth eggs and biscuit in the morning. Stew or beans at supper. Always covered. Always waiting. Levi always came back for it eventually. Ruth never once mentioned that she noticed. On the 3rd evening, Ezra came inside at dusk. The lamp was lit. The table was set for 4 3 plates and 1 more. Ruth's at the far end. Jonah was already in his chair, kicking his legs, telling the salt shaker about a grasshopper he'd caught. Ezra stood in the doorway. The light was warm and the bread smell had soaked into the walls and something in his chest unlocked that he'd spent 8 months bolting shut. Ruth looked up from the stove. She saw him standing there. She turned back to the pot without a word. And that's when the trouble really started. Not because anything went wrong, because something went right. Outside. The broken fence caught the last of the daylight. 3 posts leaning, wire slack in the heat. He'd look at it again tomorrow. He'd look at it again the day after that. On the porch, Levi sat in the cooling dark. He watched Ruth through the window as she hummed something low and tuneless over the dishes. He didn't go inside. But he didn't leave, either. The town had eyes 2 weeks in. Ruth went to town for flour and salt. She knew before she reached the general store. 2 women at the water trough stopped talking the moment she passed. Then started again when she was 10 feet gone, voices dropping to that particular pitch that carries further than a whisper because it's designed to. A man she didn't recognize tipped his hat with too much politeness. The kind that's really just curiosity wearing manners. Mrs. Bellwether was behind the counter. She weighed the flour slowly, taking her time, letting the silence fill up the space between them. Settling in at the Hollis place, are we? I'm working there. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Bellwether wrote the price on a slip of paper. A young woman, under a widower's roof. No ring I can see. No arrangement either, I'd wager. She looked up with the steady eyes of a woman who'd appointed herself the conscience of this town. Folks notice things, dear. I'm sure you understand. Ruth understood. She'd understood since she was 15 that a woman alone was either pitied or suspected. And the distance between the two was shorter than most people thought. The pastor's wife caught her outside. She touched Ruth's arm with the particular gentleness of someone delivering a verdict they've already made. You know, the boarding house has a room opening up next week. Might be more. Comfortable for a young woman on her own. Ruth walked home in 102-degree heat carrying 10 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of salt, and the full weight of a town that had decided what she was before she'd opened her mouth. The dust stuck to her neck. Sweat drew lines down her back. She thought about the boarding house and the dollar she didn't have for it and the stagecoach she couldn't afford to take anywhere else and the bench outside the post office where she'd sat 5 weeks ago with her hands in her lap and nowhere on this earth to go. She stood at the ranch gate doing the arithmetic of a woman with no options. The answer hadn't changed. Then Jonah came running from the porch. He took her hand and pulled her toward the house, talking fast about a frog he'd found in the water trough, and Ruth let herself be towed forward because there was nowhere behind her worth turning to. At the gate he stopped. He opened his fist and held up the wooden button, offering it to her. His mother's button. The last small piece of something gone. Ruth knelt in the dust. She folded his fingers back around it, gentle as closing a Bible. That's yours, sweetheart. You keep hold of it. That evening, Ezra asked if everything went fine in town. Ruth set his plate down. Fine, she said, and turned back to the stove. The lie sat between them like a stone in a boot, not enough to stop you walking. Just enough to change how. The fence and the silence. Ezra started on the fence a Saturday morning when the heat broke 90 before 8 o'clock. He didn't ask for help. Ruth brought water at 9. At 9:30 she was holding fence posts steady while he hammered, and neither of them had discussed how that happened. They worked in a silence that had changed character over the past 2 weeks. Not the empty kind that sits between strangers, but the full kind that sits between people who've decided, without saying so, that words would only complicate what their hands already understood. Their fingers nearly touched passing the canteen. Ezra pulled back first. Ruth's gaze went to the fence wire. The space between their hands was maybe 2 inches. It was the loudest 2 inches on the whole ranch. By midday they'd mended 3 posts. 5 more to go. Half done. Ruth wiped her forehead with her sleeve, and Ezra looked at the 3 straight posts and the 5 leaning ones and felt something settle in his chest that was either hope or the kind of fear that dresses up like hope when it wants to get close to you. That afternoon, the bay mare kicked through the water trough and split the wood. Water flooded the paddock and the mare panicked, rearing, hooves flashing, and Jonah was standing 12 feet away, holding a handful of grass he'd been bringing her. Ruth covered the distance in 3 strides. She scooped Jonah up with one arm and rolled sideways as a hoof came down where his head had been. They hit the mud together. Jonah screamed. The mare bolted through the broken fence through the part they hadn't mended yet and disappeared into the scrub. Ezra reached them in time to see Ruth sitting in the mud with Jonah pressed against her chest, her hand cradling the back of his skull, her whole body shaking. Jonah was crying. Ruth wasn't. Her jaw was set so tight the muscles stood out like wire. That night Levi spoke to her for the first time. She was clearing the supper dishes. He'd taken his plate to the porch as always, but he came inside to return it, set it on the counter himself instead of leaving it on the step. He stood there, 7 years old, with his father's jaw and his dead mother's gray eyes. "You ain't my mother." Ruth dried her hands on the cloth. "I know. I ain't trying to be. Not softness exactly. More like the first crack in ice that would take a long time to break all the way through." He sat at the table for supper the next night. Ezra watched from the hall, and his hands went still on his belt buckle, and he stopped breathing for a moment because he hadn't seen his 2 boys at a full table in 8 months. Later that week, Ruth found Nora's Sunday dress in a trunk in the back bedroom. Blue cotton, white collar, 3 buttons on the cuff, 1 missing. She looked at the dress a long time. She understood the wooden button now, where it came from, what it carried, why a 4-year-old boy held it like a rope tied to something that had already sailed away. She folded the dress back along its creases. She closed the trunk. She said nothing. They had 3 good weeks. I want you to remember that. 104 degrees. The thermometer outside the general store read 104 the day Jonah collapsed. He'd been sluggish since morning, picking at his breakfast, lying on the kitchen floor instead of trailing Ruth from room to room. By noon, his skin was hot enough to feel from 3 inches away. By 2 o'clock, he was shaking under a quilt in July, teeth chattering, eyes glassy, his small body burning from the inside like a stove somebody forgot to damp. "Fetch water from the well," Ruth told Levi. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "Cold as you can get it. Go now." Levi ran. He didn't ask questions. He ran like a boy who'd already lost 1 person and understood. In the deep marrow of his 7-year-old bones. What it sounded like when it started happening again. Ruth tore strips from a clean sheet. She soaked them in the bucket Levi hauled back and laid them across Jonah's forehead, his chest, the insides of his wrists where the blood ran close to the skin. 40 pounds of bone and shallow breath. His lips cracked. His eyelids fluttered without opening. The wooden button was clutched in his fist, even now, even delirious, even burning. His fingers wouldn't unlock from around it. Ezra came in from the cattle at dusk, and the color left his face so fast it was like watching a candle blown out. He knelt beside the bed. "How long?" "Since noon. I'll ride for the doc." "In the dark." "It's 14 miles to Dr. Farrow and 14 back. You'll break your horse's leg in a ravine, and Jonah won't have a father by morning." Ruth wrung out a cloth. Her voice was level and her hands had steadied because panic was a luxury she didn't have room for. "I've nursed fevers before. Stay. I need you here." He stayed. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up, and Ruth sat across from him with Jonah between them. And the lamp burned low and the night stretched out like something you could walk across if only you knew which direction led to morning. They didn't speak. Hours passed. Ruth sang once, low. Something without words, just melody. Just sound to press back against the silence. She changed the cloths. She checked his breathing. She counted seconds between each shallow rise of his chest, and the math was terrifying. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. 5 seconds where nothing moved and the world stopped. She questioned herself in the dark. Should she have sent Levi to the neighbor's place? Was she enough? Was she making the same mistake she'd made with her own mother 2 years ago, believing that love could substitute for medicine? That staying was the same as saving. At 3 in the morning, Jonah's fever broke. His breathing steadied. The flush drained from his cheeks like a tide pulling back from a shore it had nearly swallowed. Ruth's hands started shaking again. 8 hours of holding steady, and now her body was collecting every debt at once. Ezra reached across the bed and put his hand over hers. Not the near miss of the canteen. A full, deliberate weight, his palm on her knuckles. His fingers closing around her trembling fingers. And the warmth of his hand was so different from the heat of the fever that it felt like a different element entirely. Neither of them said a word. Neither of them moved. They stayed like that until dawn came gray and heavy through the window. Mrs. Bellwether's daughter rode past the ranch at first light. She saw the lamp that had burned all night in the bedroom window. By noon, the whole town knew. The easy thing. The pastor came on Tuesday. He sat at Ezra's kitchen table with his hands flat on his knees, thumbs pressing into the fabric of his trousers the way a man does when he's trying to keep his words measured. He spoke in the careful, reasonable voice of someone who genuinely believed he was doing a kindness. I ain't here to make trouble, Ezra. Lord knows you've had your share, but folks are talking, and I'd be failing my duty if I didn't say something. Ezra sat across from him. His coffee was untouched. The morning light came through the window Ruth had curtained with flour sacks, and it fell across the table in a pattern that looked, if you weren't careful, like something warm. A young woman under your roof all night. Lamp burning in the bedroom window. Now, I ain't saying nothing happened, but it don't matter what happened. Ezra, it matters what it looks like. The pastor's thumbs pressed harder. You got 2 boys. Their name is your name. A girl nobody knows, no people, no ring. A letter from a dead man living under your roof ain't just talk. It's a question about what kind of father you are. The words landed one at a time, like nails driven into soft wood. Quiet, precise, each one sinking in a little further than the last. Either you marry her, and we both know that ain't what this is, or you let her go. That's the decent thing. The decent thing. The easy thing. The thing that cost Ezra nothing except the one person who'd held his son through a fever and mended half his fence and set his table for 4 every night for 5 weeks without once asking for more than $1 and a room. Ruth was at the end of the hallway. Ezra could feel her there the way you feel weather shifting, a change in the air. A different weight in the room. He knew she could hear every word. He knew what she was waiting for. The pastor waited too. All Ezra had to do was say it. She stays. 2 words. He could have said, she saved my boy's life, and she stays in my house, and you can tell this town whatever you damn well please. He could have stood up from that table and spoken for the first time in his life with the full force of what he felt, and it would have changed everything. He said nothing. The silence filled the kitchen the way water fills a boot cold, heavy, rising. Ruth heard it. She heard every word he didn't say. She heard her name in the space where he should have put it, and it wasn't there. And the absence of her name was louder than anything the pastor had said. The pastor stood. You're a good man, Ezra. You'll do right by those boys. He walked out. The screen door closed behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Ezra sat at the table. His hands lay flat on the wood. Useless. The same hands that had held Ruth's 8 hours through a fever and couldn't hold 2 words together when it mattered. Levi was in the hallway, 7 years old. He'd heard everything. He looked at his father and said nothing. Because he was learning. He was learning his father's only lesson. That evening, Ruth pulled the rope-tied suitcase from under the bed. She didn't start packing. Not yet. But the suitcase was on the floor now, open, waiting. The way an answer waits after a question nobody had the courage to ask. The cloth on the counter. Ruth packed before dawn. 2 dresses, 1 apron, the hairbrush with the cracked handle. 4 minutes. Done. The suitcase closed with the same rope and the same knots she'd tied in Kansas. And the only difference between the woman who'd packed it then and the woman who packed it now was 5 weeks of bread baked, floors scrubbed, fevers nursed, and one touch of a man's hand across a sick child's bed that she would carry in her nerve endings for the rest of her life. She left 3 things behind. The dead employer's reference letter. She placed on the kitchen table, flat, centered, like a document that had completed its purpose. She didn't need credentials from a ghost anymore. Whatever came next, she'd walk into it with her own 2 hands and the calluses on her palms and nothing else. And that would have to be enough because it was all she'd ever had. Levi's portion on the counter, covered with a cloth, eggs and biscuit, still warm. The ritual she'd built over 5 weeks. Every meal, without fail leaving his plate covered, never pressing, never mentioning. She smoothed the cloth once with her palm, the way you smooth a letter before sealing it, and stepped back. The fence was visible through the kitchen window, half mended, 3 posts standing straight, 5 still leaning into the wind that wasn't blowing. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at it until looking became its own kind of goodbye. She went to Jonah's room. He was sitting on the bed, bare feet dangling, holding the wooden button. 4 years old, and he already knew. Children read the air the way animals read weather, not with logic, but with the whole surface of their skin. You going somewhere? I am, sweetheart. He opened his fist. The button sat in his palm brown. Ordinary, worn to silk by 8 months of gripping. His mother's button. The last piece of a woman he barely remembered, carried like a compass that still pointed toward something even though the place it pointed to was gone. He held it out to Ruth. She took it. She closed his small fingers around the empty space where it had been and kissed them. And her jaw tightened and her throat locked and she swallowed once. Hard. Because she had decided a long time ago that nobody gets to see her break. Levi was in the hallway, silent, still. His arms hung at his sides and his face was his father's face, closed tight, watching the one person who'd cracked it open walk away without a word to stop her. He didn't speak. He was 7. He had already learned. Ezra was on the porch. The morning heat was rising and the road was pale with dust and the whole valley stretched out in front of them, wide and indifferent and going nowhere she needed to be. Ruth. She stopped. She turned. She waited. His mouth opened. His jaw worked. The word had been her name, and it had taken everything he had just to get that far. And now he stood on his own porch with the rest of the sentence dissolving somewhere between his chest and his teeth. And the silence that came out of him was the same silence that had kept him from telling anyone how bad things had gotten. The same silence that had let Nora's fever burn one day too long before he rode for the doctor. The same silence that sat in him like a stone he'd swallowed years ago and never learned to cough up. He had nothing after her name. Ruth looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at a fence that's never going to be finished, not with anger, not with pity, just with the quiet clarity of someone who's finally stopped waiting for the last nail. She walked down the road. The gate creaked shut behind her. She didn't look back. The dust rose around her boots and settled behind her, and the road was long and pale and empty, and she walked it the way she'd walked into Elk Ridge 5 weeks ago, straight-backed, steady, carrying everything she had. Rain on the porch. The rain came that evening. After 6 weeks of drought, it arrived without warning, no thunder first, no darkening sky, just the sudden hiss of water hitting scorched earth. Steam rose from the road in pale columns. The smell of dust turning to mud filled the air like something breathing for the first time. The broken fence darkened in the downpour. The half that was mended held firm, posts straight, wire taut, doing exactly what it was built to do. The other half sagged lower under the weight of the water, leaning further into the ground, giving up by inches. Ezra sat on the porch. He'd been sitting there since Ruth walked down the road, and the distance between then and now felt like something measured not in hours but in the number of times he'd opened his mouth and closed it again. The rain drummed on the porch roof and turned the yard into a shallow lake and ran in rivulets down the road, the same road she'd taken, the same dust now washing away to nothing, as if the ground itself was trying to erase the path she'd walked so he couldn't follow it, even if he found the words. Levi sat beside him. The boy hadn't spoken since morning. He sat with his boots dangling off the edge of the step, watching the rain with the flat, steady gaze of a man who'd already learned that the people who mattered most were the ones you let walk away in silence. He was 7 years old, and he looked 40. Pot Jonah stood in the doorway, barefoot, one fist open and empty, fingers curled around the space where the button used to be. When's Ruth coming back? The rain came down harder. It pounded the porch roof and sheeted off the eaves, and the sound of it was so full, so heavy, that it almost covered the silence where an answer should have been. Ezra didn't answer. He couldn't. The word that would have started the sentence was Ruth, and he'd already proven, this morning, that her name was as far as he could get. The lamp in the window was still burning. Ruth's habit, she'd lit it every evening for 5 weeks. A small thing, automatic. The kind of gesture that becomes part of a house's breathing without anyone deciding it should. The flame leaned in its glass chimney like something waiting for a door to open. Ezra looked at it through the window. He didn't turn it off. Inside, the cloth still covered the plate on the counter. Eggs and biscuit, cold now. Tomorrow he would remove the cloth and wash the plate and put it back in the cupboard. And the ritual would end the way all rituals end, when the person who gave them meaning walks out the door. Levi wouldn't eat tonight. Ezra knew that already. Levi would sit on this porch until the rain soaked through his shirt, and then he'd go inside and lie in his bed and stare at the ceiling with his father's silence wrapped around him like a coat he'd never asked to wear. Jonah's fist was open, small fingers curled around nothing. The button was in Ruth's pocket now. Somewhere on the road out of Elk Ridge, a brown, ordinary thing, carried by a woman who'd saved a boy's life and mended half a fence and set a table for 4 and walked away with more dignity than the man who'd let her go would ever deserve. The rain came the way forgiveness sometimes does after the damage, after the silence, after the thing you should have said had already walked out the door and down the road and out of sight. It fell on the mended posts and the broken ones. It fell on the empty road and the full porch. It fell on Ezra's hands, open on his knees, the same hands that had held hers through a fever and couldn't hold a single sentence together when the morning came. The fence was half mended, the lamp was still lit. And Ezra sat on his porch with his 2 boys, listening to the sound of water falling on everything he hadn't held on to. I have to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it a moment before you answer. If speaking up meant the whole town turned against you, if it meant your children heard the whispers and your name became the thing people said when they meant foolish, would you have said it anyway? Would you have said those 2 words, or would you have sat on that porch, listening to the rain, knowing exactly what your silence cost and carrying it for the rest of your life?